All those years of Sunday school?
Wasn't it on the boat?
That's supposed to be the most important story. Paul said, if Christ is not risen, our faith is vain, right? So are there any Christians here? Where did that first post-resurrection appearance happen? Well, it depends.
The upper room where they were out.
Okay, good. That's one account. You're actually right. In one account, it happened in a room in Jerusalem, right? But in Matthew, the first post-resurrection account happened in Galilee. You know where Galilee is? It's at least 60 miles away, maybe 100, depending where. It was a mountain in Galilee. So, and in fact, we know it was Galilee because that was the message that the angel said at the tomb. He's not here, he is risen. He goes before you unto Galilee. There you will see him. So the disciples in Matthew went to Galilee, and they saw him, but some doubted. If that wasn't the first appearance, why would some doubt? Obviously, if you're just reading Matthew alone, even at the Last Supper in Matthew, Jesus said he would see them in Galilee. The angel said, you'll see me in Galilee. And so they went to Galilee, and they saw him in Galilee. That's where the appearance happened. But that was a long way away, and in those days, how would they have got up there? Even with the fastest racehorses, it would have taken, what, 4 or 5 hours? How long would it take to race 60 miles without a rest in those days? To get up to Galilee, to meet Jesus, and then get back to Jerusalem for this leisurely stroll to Emmaus, and then to have a dinner later in the room in Jerusalem that night. So did the accident happen in Reno or Sacramento? Obviously, that's a huge discrepancy. And there are, in my challenge, I list about 17 or 18. Here's another question. When the women came to the tomb on Easter morning, was the tomb open or was it closed? Which was it? Who says open? Who says closed? You're both right. Because both accounts happen. In Matthew, if you read it, and Matthew's not broken up, if you read, the authors of the Gospel were very careful to put time markers. If you read the chapters before and after, you see they would put a marker, and then it so happened, and on the next day, they were very careful to put markers in there. And so when the women arrived on Easter morning in Matthew, the stone was in front of the grave, and it hadn't been rolled away yet. But then there was an earthquake, and an angel came in their presence and rolled the stone away from the tomb. By the way, earthquake? Matthew describes 2 earthquakes in the story. One at the crucifixion that was so big that it ripped the curtain. Right? I mean, that's a pretty big earthquake, right? How many of you sat through some earthquakes? Did you see any curtains ripped? What kind of an earthquake would it have to be? It's pretty big, right? And then on Easter morning, there's another earthquake big enough to roll the stone away from the tomb, Matthew says. Ignoring the fact that no other gospel writer mentions these earthquakes, only Matthew did. Ignoring the fact that no historian and there's no archaeological evidence that there was an earthquake at the time. That would have been the story. That earthquake, instead of the women casually bringing spices to the tomb and Jesus walking to the road to Emmaus, there would have been horrible destruction and death and mayhem and homes destroyed and children killed. Those women would have been tending to their relatives. I mean, that would have been a massive story, and Matthew just tosses it into it. Matthew was in the habit of exaggerating a lot. In fact, at the crucifixion, he got a lot of things wrong about the Old Testament, too. Luke was better, by the way. If you had to pick between Matthew and Luke, Luke was probably more reliable. Matthew said, you're forced to pick, right? So Matthew said that during the resurrection, Matthew said during the crucifixion that the earthquake was so big, the graves of Jerusalem opened. And people crawled out of the graves and went back to their homes. Dead people who'd been dead for a long time. That's the headline. Can you imagine that? Nobody seemed to notice that. But that was the resurrection before Jesus. Matthew said it happened. What did they do? What were they wearing? What did they look like? Zombie. This is really a Halloween story. It really is. When they come walking back, did they go back to their former spouse and I'm here in their job? He just tosses that in like it's this. He liked to prove how big and important the story was with earthquakes and eclipses and all this stuff. It's obviously mythological, a lot of it. Something probably did happen because we do have a Christian religion and there were some believers who thought something happened. But the resurrection story is not only internally incompatible, For example, in John, when Mary comes back from the tomb, Mary goes to the tomb, right? You think you know the story, right? She goes to the tomb and then she comes back to the disciples, and in the book of John, Mary says, they've taken his body away from the tomb and we don't know where they've laid him. She didn't know Jesus had been resurrected. She came back from the tomb and didn't know it. She told them, what's going on? But in the other three Gospels, the Synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, she knows that Jesus was resurrected. So which way is it? Did she know or didn't she? There's a whole bunch of these things. But not only are these internal discrepancies within the resurrection stories, which have never been put together, although you can buy some Bibles that have gospel harmonies. Have you seen them? The harmony of the Gospels? Why would a perfect, all-loving, all-knowing God write something that needed to be harmonized in the first place, to be understood? Besides, the harmonies don't work. They just put them side by side saying, okay, see? But when you try to put them together into a story, the pieces don't fit. I challenge you to try it. It's worth trying. Since 1992, 2 people have actually sent me serious attempts to do that. But in one of them, it involved time travel and in another one, it involved taking 2 words from this verse and 2 words from that verse and moving this verse over here and moving this and changing this and then changing the tense of the verbs and totally, it was totally damaging, the script of the Bible. He basically admitted it. So no one has yet done that, and I would challenge you to do that, even if you're not a believer. It's a pretty good exercise just to see how a myth is created, to see how it happens. And then a very strong evidence that the resurrection did not happen. Even if they were totally in agreement and there were no discrepancies, right? Even if everything was fine. A very strong argument against the historicity of the resurrection is the fact that if you take the documents when they were written, the earliest one was Paul. The earliest account we have is Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, where he gives that formula about the appearances, and then he appeared last of all to me, to prove that he was one of the in crowd too. He puts his own name. So he's obviously editing that story. Then we have Mark. Paul wrote his story about the year 55 to 57. When, if the story really happened, it happened around the year 30. So we're talking about a quarter of a century later, Paul writes this thing. The very first thing about the resurrection ever written in history was at least 25 years after it happened. And he wrote it to the church in Corinth, which by land was 1,500 miles away. So these people in Corinth are the first ones to read the story that happened a quarter of a century ago, 1,500 miles away from them. There's no way they're going to check it. There's no way they're going to know. They're just taking Paul's word for it. And suspiciously, 500 people saw Jesus. It's sort of suspiciously round number. But at least we have that document. At least we have evidence that some people thought there was a resurrection. But then, about 15 years later, around the year 70, is where Mark writes his gospel. Then around 80 or so is where Matthew and Luke, 80 to 85, they write their gospel. That's a half century after the events, right? These supposed eyewitnesses. And then after the year 90 sometime, then John writes his, right? So we have this kind of, across the first century, these documents where they're written. Now some scholars want to move them earlier, some want to move them later, but shifting the dates doesn't shift the curve. What we notice in all these accounts, if you will take them all and count the number of what we would call extraordinary events, or amazing events, like angels and earthquakes and ascensions and dematerializing through doors, Jesus was an incognito. That's another Halloween story. He must have had a costume on, because these guys didn't recognize him until, oh, it's Jesus. And they should have known. They were talking, his own disciples. But if you take them all, if you take the number of extraordinary events, you'll notice that the number in each of these documents increases over time. They increase from the very beginning. There is no extraordinary, outrageous event in Paul. And then, let's wait for questions until after here. I'd love to talk to you, but wait. So Jesus may have existed. We don't know, but he may have existed. I'm not saying he didn't, but I think the probability is low. So what it proves is that we see the footprints of legend on the resurrection story that we see on other stories. We see it getting more exaggerated across time. In the book of 1 Corinthians, it's very simple. There was no empty tomb. There was actually no resurrection. 1 Corinthians 15 doesn't use the word resurrect, even though Paul knew that word. And there was actually no actual physical meaning. He used the word appearance. It'd be like, before the resurrection story, Jesus was described in normal terms. He met people, he talked to people, people followed him. It's just like a normal narrative. But after Easter, it changes, and Jesus is described now as appearing unto. What if I told you, I know my next door neighbor is home because I went to her house and she appeared unto me. What a weird word. It'd be like a ghost haunted house kind of thing, and then disappeared. And in the New Testament, you see that. Jesus appeared to the disciples 4 times. It's a very strange word. That word appearance is the same word that the word vision comes from. Opthi is the past participle. It's from orao, where we get the word vision. And so visionary experiences are being described here, not a real meaning. So I think some of the early disciples must have thought Jesus died and went to heaven, like Grandma dies and goes to heaven. And then Grandma appears to me, and I can hear Grandma's voice. And so maybe these early believers, after the disconfirmation of their faith when Jesus was killed, these believers were talking to Jesus, and in their own minds, Jesus was appearing to them. But it was not a flesh and blood appearance. It was not a physical thing that happened there. In Mark, we have one young man at the tomb. That's it. In fact, there's no resurrection in Mark. You read the book of Mark, it's just an empty tomb, and the women didn't say anything to anybody. In Matthew, then, we have 2. And now we have 2 angels. And then, 1 angel, and then in Luke we have 2. And then in John we have 2 complete angels. So you see the number of men, and then whether they're angels or not. The number of women grows as the story grows. And all sorts of other amazing things that happen. And so if you put that on a curve, you see this curve going up through the first century. You see how myths and legends are created. It even happens in our own day. We see things happen where people believe a simple truth, and as time goes by, it gets exaggerated. So the resurrection story, besides being internally contradictory, shows all the footprints of human myth-making. There was no empty tomb. There was no actual bodily resurrection. And the early believers didn't even think that. It was later believers who thought that. And the mistake that a lot of modern Christians make is they're looking from the 20th to 21st century back at the first century through the lens of John and thinking it was all flat, thinking the whole story was sort of written right at that time. You often hear that one of the proofs of Christianity is the disciples died these horrible deaths. They became martyrs. But if that's true, how did any of them live long enough to write those Gospels? Because the life expectancy in first century Rome was about 45. So how old were those disciples in the year 30? Assume they were like college students in the early 20s. Luke was a tax collector, so maybe he was older. But they would have been halfway through their lives already. We heard that they suffered these horrible martyrdoms, and they lived for their faith and they were killed. But then they lived in Matthew and Mark and in John way into the 90s. How old would he have been? It's possible. There were some people who lived into the thin edge of that bell curve but with life expectancy so short, we do know now, and most scholars now know, that those Gospels were not written by eyewitnesses. They were written by second generation or third generation members of the church. And they got a lot of their history wrong as they wrote back, as they were goofing. So there's a lot more to say about why scholars are doubtful of the resurrection of Jesus. But I think if you follow Bayes at all, if you follow probability, because all history is probabilistic, I think we can safely say that the probability of an actual bodily resurrection of Jesus from the tomb based on those documents is very, very low. It's not 0. None of us would say it's 0, but it's certainly not more than 0.5. I would put it way down at 0.05 or something. Maybe you would put it higher or lower. And in any event, we have to make some kind of a judgment about how likely we think the story really is. If you're a true believer like I was, you round it up to 100. He rose from the dead. I know it because I feel it in my heart. But if you're critical, like a lot of people in this room, you drop that probability pretty low for very good reasons. Now I've talked way too long, so we can do questions now. Who's going to handle